Welcome back. Thanks for joining. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it. So the last video I did was setting up a new differential on one of these new Jeeps. Now I'm doing a repair on a Dana 70 in this differential. A friend of mine asked me, he said, you stated you had a couple of tricks in doing differentials, so how about if we go over some of those? So that's what I'm going to do on a lot of this video. This is one of the real popular yokes that are being converted into these new Jeeps. It's a 1350 yoke. So changing your yoke or changing a pinion seal is why I learned how to do this trick. I'm changing the yoke on this differential from a 1350 to a 1410 yoke. Big, huge joint. Now, this 14 bolt, like a lot of differentials, has a crush sleeve. And once that crush sleeve's crushed, it's a one-time use deal. So if you remove this pinion, in order to get your preload back, generally you have to put a new crush sleeve in. That is the correct way to do it. Now, there's a few tricks that you can do if you're going to change a pinion seal or change a yoke and you don't want to take the section out and go ahead and replace a crush sleeve. Now, my best recommendation would be whenever you rebuild one of these rear ends, if you can get a crush sleeve eliminator, you're better off. Then you don't even have to worry about it. Once it's set, it's set. But this particular one is still a crush sleeve, and I'm going to swap this yoke out without changing the crush sleeve. Just to give you an idea of kind of what's going on, if this race is seated into the housing, you've got your bearing and your crush sleeve, and then your outer bearing, which is also, this won't hold because it'll fall, but this would be seated into the housing as well. And what's happening when your pinion goes through this and you start tightening this up, you hit this crush sleeve and it stops. Then once this crush sleeve starts to compress, that's where it'll take the sloppy play out of your pinion, but you don't want to go too far because you just want to retain the load on the bearings. And that load is where your inch-pound rating is. So on this 14 bolt, what I've done is I snugged that yoke back down to about 150 pounds, which meant I took all the slop out of here. I had no play left. Now I start going up on torque in increments, and I'm watching, let's say my finger here is the nut, and I keep torquing it, and that nut doesn't move, and it doesn't move, and it doesn't move. And then when I hit about 250 pounds, I can feel the nut slightly turn. And when I feel that nut slightly turn, what's happening is I'm starting to crush that sleeve again. And if you just feel that nut start to turn, and that crush sleeve just starts to crush some more, what that means is I'm adding some more preload, knowing I have no space left between here, and I'm back at where it was originally torqued or very close to it. Now, when that nut first starts moving, you are going to gain a couple of inch-pounds on your preload for these bearings, which is okay. You can generally get away with that. What you don't want to do is crank this around and tighten those bearings up. You'll lose the bearings then, and you'll end up rebuilding the rear end. So first thing I did is take the big nut off, but I took this little arrow here and I marked the pinion. Now, if I'm just changing a seal, I would put the yoke back on in the exact same position, put the nut on and tighten it down to where that was in the exact same position, and then go just a skosh more, just to put a little more load on that pinion. But what I did do is I can feel the pinion resistance, and you can check it with an inch-pound wrench as well, but you do enough of them, you can really feel how it's supposed to be before it makes contact with the pinion. So since I'm changing the yoke, there's no point in marking this. That would be just a waste of time because it's not going back on. So I pulled it off, and you can see this nice new seal. I did tap a new seal in just for the just in case. It wasn't leaking, but I always like having a new seal in. So the next part of this little adventure is getting the yoke. There's a big difference in a 1350 to a 1410 yoke. U-joints are monstrous on this for it just being a one-ton truck. So first thing I want to do on the new yoke, put some grease on here so that that new seal does not burn up. Put a little bit of silicone on here, which will keep it from bleeding any fluid out through the splines and the thread. You can see it doesn't take a lot. Again, you don't have to use a ton of silicone. Put that on. This is a lock nut, so I don't have to worry about using any thread lock. First thing I'm going to do is just run it down with this little 3/8 impact. It won't over torque it. Okay. Now, I can feel that there's no play front to back. That means I'm at least snugged up against the bearing and pulling the crush sleeve a little bit. Now, I still believe that when you take these off, that crush sleeve is going to spring back maybe only 1/1000th, but that's all you really need. All that crush sleeve is doing is putting some tension on those bearings as you're giving them preload. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a torque wrench and I'm going to start tightening this a little bit more. I'm going to do that by hand. And the reason I'm doing this by hand is because I know it's going to take, you know, more than 30 or 40 pounds, which is all that little light impact is going to do. So now I'm at about 120 pounds. Continue to increase the torque in increments until that nut just starts to move. Okay, it hasn't moved yet. Still hasn't moved. Ooh, I think we're on the verge. Well, at 250 pounds, that nut felt like it was just starting to move. So right at 250 pounds, I felt the socket move, and I mean it moved very little. And I've got a beautiful, smooth, it's easily within the same spec that it came out as. And you can use an inch-pound wrench to see where the pinion starts to move. So that's the way you can kind of cheat the system if you want to try to do either a yoke swap or a seal swap without changing the crush sleeve. I've done it a lot, it works, but it is not the proper method by the book. So the next trick I was asked about was when you kind of have to start over or setting up shims for your backlash, and someone noticed that I put my shims on the ARB on the non-air side. I put my shims on the inside of the bearing, not the outside. And if you read ARB's instructions, they give you the shims and tell you to put shims on the outside, but you can put original Dana 60 shims on the inside. Now, there's a reason I do this. First thing is factory setup, you'll have your shims and a bearing that is pressed on. Now, if you noticed, I did not press this bearing on. The inside of this bearing I've machined out so that it'll slide on, and I call this a setup bearing. Now, the reason ARB tells you to put the shims on the outside is you can press the bearing on once, and then these shims go to the outside, and it does the same thing. It just moves your ring gear closer and further from the pinion and sets your backlash. Now, the reason I don't like doing this, sometimes you have these really, really thin shims, And if you have a thin shim on the outside and you start sliding it in, it can fold it and damage it. Whereas when you're using the shims on the inside, even on this super thin shim, if that shim's in here, you can slide this in and out of the carrier several times and you will never damage that shim. So having a setup bearing, if you're going to do gears, you can take a carbide burr, wear safety glasses by all means, and just grind some of that out on your old bearing, and then you'll have a setup bearing. And you can adjust your backlash right on the money, set your shims in there, press them together, final backlash, and you're good to go. So that's one of my other tricks that I prefer, is on the one side, bearings on the inside of the shim. On the ARB side, when I was doing that ARB 60, it really didn't do you any good to try to put shims on the inside of that bearing, because the shims on the other side sandwich between the air collar and the bearing surface. So this side's the critical side if you're going to do that. It sure makes my life a lot easier, so you don't end up with shims that look like this. Because of this shim, we had to rebuild the entire differential. And you can see the grind marks on this bearing. This is for our Dana 44 setup bearings. This one is my Dana 60 setup bearing. There's a big difference there. But I have several of these bearings that I use for setup, just so that I can set backlash a lot easier. Now pinion nuts. In these differential tricks and videos is save the old nut and use the old original nut to get your setup done. And the reason being is 4 or 5 times with some heavy torque on these lock nuts, and it pretty much strips the lock nut out or weakens it or pulls threads, and you'll end up with a problem if you're trying to use the final assembly lock nut when you're doing your setup. So I always recommend use the old nuts, and then on your final assembly use the new one, and it may come in a couple of different styles. But when you use the new one on your final assembly, you know there's no threads pulled, you know it's a clean, good solid piece of metal. Well, hopefully these couple little tricks will help you when you go to do some not even differential work, but even driveline work. If your differential is a crush sleeve type differential, you can save yourself a lot of future headache in replacing inner and outer bearings on a pinion by paying real close attention to your torque and your inch pounds for replacing that yoke when you do a drive shaft upgrade. Also, I hope if you're doing a air locker conversion or changing some backlash shims or re-geared it, if you have the old bearings, making a couple setup bearings can save you a lot of time. It can also save you damage on the bearings. Even with my cool little bearing tools, I've damaged bearings before, so I hate buying new bearings when I already had new bearings. So a couple of setup bearings can, number one, save you a whole bunch of time. Second thing it will do is allow you to get more precise, and if you can do more precision easier, you tend to do more precision. When you have to press bearings on and off, you tend to get close enough's good enough, and that doesn't always in your best interest when doing a differential. So setup bearings are a good thing to have when you're doing some of these, so keep that in mind too. And remember, do your setup with the old pinion nut, not the new pinion nut. So that's going to do it for this part of the shop video. Now I'm going to share one of my last wheeling videos from last season, and thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. I do appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Got a cool build we're going to start soon. Nice. Just hold that line. it.